Hello and welcome to the Overland Journal podcast. I'm your host, Scott Brady, and I'm here with Matt Scott, my co-host. What's going on, Matt?
You know what? It's just what is today? Today's a Friday.
It is.
So when we're recording, at least, it's been a really good week. So
it has been a good week. I was just on the Land Cruiser 200 Series Heritage Edition launch.
Ooh, you know how I like black Land Cruisers with bronze wheels.
And that's exactly what it was. I was grateful for the fact that they do have a white option, so it actually something that can.
Does it still have the bronze wheels?
It does. It absolutely does. And then it comes with like an $80 Yakima rack on top. So
that looked a little bit cheesy on a almost $100,000 car.
Yeah, $90,000 car.
Yeah, a little bit cheesy.
Yeah, they make great racks, but it seemed like it was way too small.
Yeah, it was just the rack that they chose is the rack that you'd see on a RAV4, not a $90,000 off-road car.
Yeah, it needed to be a larger rack, I think, for the vehicle. But what was another thing that was cool about it, they were pretty mindful of it, is they did a third row delete. So
cool.
That adds some additional payload. They also skipped the running boards right out of the factory, which I thought was cool.
Yeah, that's nice.
And then their Heritage Edition logo that they had on the back window.
That Toyota Land Cruiser, very classic, but not. It was just perfect. Taken from a 40 or a 60.
It was perfect. They didn't adjust it at all. It is the original logo, which I thought was really nice. And the car drove great. I didn't realize how much of a difference that 8-speed made. So pairing that 5.7 with an 8-speed, you get a lower first gear and you also have 2 overdrives. So I think you're going to get better fuel economy, better overall drivability. It made the vehicle feel refreshed in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
And it's been out for a couple of years and nobody's been having any issues with them. So
gearing is very important. I've only driven that particular transmission behind the VDJ 200 with that twin turbo V8 diesel. And I can tell you that it scoots.
Yeah.
So
the diesel is definitely the motor of choice for anybody who wants a 200 series. But the 5.7 would be, I think about it often. If you were going to buy one vehicle, which is what we're going to talk about today, we're going to talk about buying used Overland vehicles.
What are the best used Overland vehicles that you can buy right now?
The 200
in North America.
Yeah, the 200 is definitely something we're going to chat about here in a little bit. So.
Yeah, definitely.
And Matt, you are the king of buying used vehicles, at least as far as somebody that
self-proclaimed vehicle ADD. So I kind of. I go through cars about the same rate people go through shoes. Which,
I was thinking underwear, but
unless you buy ex officio, they last quite a while. So I think, going into this, into buying an Overland vehicle, we are really basing this on those that intend to travel with them.
Right.
This is no disrespect to the weekend crowd, but this is people who are looking to go international, to do extended trips, whether they're here, whether they're driving to Alaska, Pan American Highway, whatever. So I think it's important for everybody to realize we're not choosing vehicles based on the fastest or the highest performing and technical terrain. We're really choosing things on, what does it cost to repair? How appropriate is the vehicle? Does it have enough payload? And also, as weird as it sounds, how much does it cost to actually upgrade these vehicles? I mean, a 200 series these days, you can get in the, low 20s, but you're looking at $4,000 for a rear bumper. If you want to, let's say, add an auxiliary tank, you're looking at $2,000 to $3,000. So we're really trying to kind of keep that in mind. We know that people are going to modify these vehicles. So we've tried to choose things in their respective low, mid, and high categories that, that are attainable to people. I guess we should just get going. First generation Tacoma, third generation 4Runner, you can't really beat them.
You really can. If you're looking at what do I spend that 10, 12, 14,000 bucks on?
Yeah.
You can get those trucks. And of course, any vehicle will do. People have driven around the world in C-Class Mercedes sedans or
Chevaux or Fiat 500,
whatever. So we're not saying that you can't take whatever you want to take around the world, but we also don't prescribe to this idea that that's something you should recommend that someone do.
No.
It's because someone's choosing, I'm going to do a stunt, or this was the vehicle my dad owned and he always wanted to drive around the world, and it's this personal connection. But I definitely don't prescribe to this idea that run whatever you brung or any vehicle will do, because that's actually very short-sighted and it puts the trip at risk. If the goal is to travel around the world, buy something suitable to support around the world travel or to support driving down to the end of Baja and back. And certainly it can be done, and it has been done in very obscure cars, but there are things that just do it better and that you can actually get serviced in the middle of Uzbekistan, where getting that Dushevo service is going to be an impossibility.
I mean, I'm all for being what I call an overland snowflake. I have been one many times in the past, but we're kind of, I guess, trying to focus on good advice here. If you want bad advice, hit me up on Instagram.
Yeah, exactly. And I think Matt and we were talking about it. Instead of just focusing on the vehicles initially, it's more about focusing on the mindset. And I think one of the big mistakes that people make when it comes to vehicle-based travel is they spend way more money on the truck and way more money on the gadgets than they ever spend on travel. And if we can encourage everyone listening to think about, if you're going to create a budget for the year, like let's say you want to drive down to Ushuaia, make sure that you spend a lot more money on the travel itself, the experience, the shipping of the vehicle. And even if you only travel domestically, are you spending more money on those fancy shocks than you spend on gas? Yeah. How many times have we seen someone buy a brand new 4Runner and they lease it because they can't afford to buy it? So they lease it and then they max out their credit card on suspension and other accessories. And then they don't even have $5 to take it on a trip. And that's really unfortunate. They miss that opportunity for those experiences.
Yeah. I mean, the thing that my travels have taught me is that wherever you go, no matter what vehicle you're in, you can be in an Earth Roamer, you could be in a Vespa. There's always going to be somebody local in the country that has a Toyota Corolla. So keep that in your head. Most of the off-road modifications that you're doing, if your focus is travel, I don't want to say that they're not needed, because that's not what I'm trying to say, but you don't need 35-inch tires to do the Pan American Highway. I mean, it's being driven by commercial trucks and families most of the time.
And you may want to do really technical routes, and that's when you need modifications.
But I think be realistic and be honest with yourself. If you can step aside from the ego that is, a lot of automotive modification, I think you're just going to be better off.
Way better off. And then you'll actually have experiences at the end of the day that'll show you at the end of it, oh, I didn't actually need that at all. And Dan Grech again comes to mind, our first guest for the podcast. He drove around South America with a stock soft top TJ.
Yeah. So by the way, that vehicle has kind of made our list only because of you.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that's an important thing, is look at your budget, make sure that you're applying more resources towards experiences than you are towards the vehicle. And that's why we really want to focus on these very affordable vehicles first, because why not do that? I crossed the Silk Road in an $8,000 Jimny. Matt has driven around Southeast Asia on scooters. It's about the experience, and it's important to remember that. So let's go down our list, Matt. What do you got for our first option for the low category?
I don't want to dwell on them too much, but you're going to hear a lot of recommendations from us that are Toyotas. That is, I guess just based on experience, Scott and I have traveled all over the world in Toyotas. They just work. I mean, honestly, if there's a Toyota 4-wheel drive that's in your price range, there's a few exceptions with a few different motors that maybe are less desirable, but they're going to be great. I mean, if you want something, let's say for Baja, I would have a hard time steering, and they're on a budget, steering them anywhere but directly to a first generation Tacoma. I mean, they are everywhere down there. And the same goes for the third generation 4Runner. I mean, some people can even sleep in them if you're not super huge. They're very reliable. They get decent fuel economy from that 6-cylinder. They're great vehicles. There's a lot of aftermarket opportunities that are affordable for them. And
it is an international platform.
It is.
That's the exception with the Tacoma. A lot of people think that the Tacoma has some DNA connection to a Hilux. There's actually very little.
Yeah, very little
than the badge.
I want to say the doors are the same or something like that.
Possibly, but the frame is very different. And because of that, it has a very low payload. Most international Hilux vehicles are going to be a full metric ton. Most of the Tacomas that we've got has been 1,200, 1,300 pound payload. So it's just important to not overload any of these vehicles, even the 4Runner, based upon a Prado 120 international chassis. You're still dealing with a vehicle with a very low payload, 1,400 pounds approximately. So once you start adding those bumpers and sliders and everything else, you can chew up a ton of payload.
And let's not forget that payload does not include passengers. It does not include fuel.
Right.
1,400 pound payload, you put 2 Americans in there. Let's be very nice and say 2 Americans is 300 pounds. And then you're talking fuel and everything. You really have 1,000 pounds of payload, and then you go from there. On that subject, I think keeping things as simple and as minimal while if you are actually traveling, that's also a huge part of it.
Yeah. I was listening to a book on the plane yesterday called Vagabonding by Rolf Potts. I think it actually might be the very best book ever for overlanders too, because he just digs into the philosophy of travel and he strips away all the gadgets. I mean, this guy traveled around the world kind of on a dare with no luggage. He left with no luggage. Like a pair of underwear stuck in his jacket pocket. It's pretty awesome. So it's just a reminder that keep this stuff simple. It's less to get stolen. It's less to have to maintain. It's less to have to buy initially. Yep. So that's really important. And most of our North American vehicles really can't support a lot of aftermarket accessories anyways with payload. The exception being, of course, the 80 series, which would be the sole Land Cruiser in this price category.
Yeah. And we'll get to the 80 in a little bit, but I think let's talk about some Nissans because they are massively underrated. I mean, you see everywhere you see a Hilux, you see a Nissan Navara, and here that's sold as a Frontier. That is actually one of, the few affordable, mid-sized trucks that is a global platform. You're going to be able to service that, almost everywhere. I mean, they're all over South America. They're all over Australia. They're all over. They're all over.
Other than,
and they even make them in Europe too.
They do. And other than Toyota possibly or Mercedes, you're going to find more Nissan dealerships globally. They're just going to be available everywhere and they're extremely popular. And we've got the Frontier as an option. We've also got the Xterra as an option. What do you think of the Xterra, Matt?
I think that Nissan is absolutely crazy for not currently making an Xterra. I think that vehicle has always been, really cool actually. It had a strong driveline from what I remember. They had a lot of usable space inside of it. I remember when they
manual transmission.
They were even available with the supercharged motor. Austin had one of those.
That's right. He did.
And why there aren't more Xterras or the Xterra doesn't get more play in this community, man, I really don't know.
Yeah, it seems like Nissan is so focused on the West Coast. If you go to California, you see Nissans everywhere.
Yeah.
But once the closer you get to the center of the country, they just aren't as available, but they are a great choice. And I like they're less likely to get stolen internationally. A Toyota, the people that own Toyotas, a lot of people don't know this, but Toyotas get stolen all the time. In fact, we have a mutual friend, Cyril, from Guatemala, originally from France, but lived in Guatemala for a long time. I asked him why he drove a Range Rover Classic. He says, because nobody wants to steal it.
Nobody can afford to maintain it.
So he was actually the safest car he could drive around.
That's funny.
In Guatemala was a Range Rover Classic because nobody would want the car. Whereas if you're driving around in an 80 series Land Cruiser, that is highly desirable.
Yeah. So before we get to that 80, let's talk about the Jeep Cherokee. That is my personal choice. If I was to leave tomorrow and I had, a $5,000 to $10,000 budget to get myself on the road, it would be a Jeep. I mean, they're here, they're available, they're relatively lightweight. I'll admit, I don't know what the payload necessarily is on them, but you can take that vehicle, buy any one of them, take that vehicle to any mechanic is going to know how to work on it in America. Put $1,000 to $2,000 into it, and you're going to have new brakes. You're going to have new U-joints. You're going to have new alternators, starters, spark plugs, coil packs, TPS sensors. Sorry. Those are the things that are going to fail on an older vehicle. And with the Cherokee, they're really, really affordable to fix.
And they're very capable too.
You can put a roof tent on one. You can have one, essentially stock. Like if you're not into the crazy off-road thing, Cherokee with a roof tent, and you're going to be able to park that in parking garages when you go to cities, which is something that people often forget is actually kind of a valid thing. Yeah.
And they're all over Mexico. You
All
can see Cherokee. So if Baja is your thing,
yeah,
that's going to be, I mean, mechanics down there see those cars all the time.
Yep.
The 4-liter Super Bomber, again, manual transmission option. Regularly, you could get poverty package units with vinyl interior and vinyl and rubber floor mats. So they can be purchased very cheap and maintained very cheaply. That's certainly a choice. I think for me, if I was to pick, my pick would probably be an early 4Runner.
Yeah.
I think like a Gen 1, Gen 2, maybe the Gen 2 with a manual transmission would be a pretty interesting choice. Gen 3 was also available with a manual.
Yeah.
And that little
and the rear locker
and the 3.4 V6. Yeah, that would definitely be my choice, would be probably a Gen 3 manual transmission 4Runner.
You know, again, it's so hard to beat the Toyotas. I mean, they're available. They're just, they work, you know,
they really do. And there certainly are Land Rovers in that price range. And Matt and I have both owned more of them than we can count.
Yeah. It's a reason they're not on the list.
Yeah.
I shouldn't say that. Land Rover people don't hate me, but I mean, if your goal is travel,
there's just a better option. If it's not a brand thing, if it's a brand you love, then absolutely travel around the world in a Series 1 Discovery. I had one for a long time and I absolutely loved the car.
It was my first car. Yeah. It's need versus wants for me. I mean, if you tell me I need to have a Land Rover, I'm going to tell you a million reasons why you don't need a Land Rover. I'm going to tell you a million reasons why you don't need a Land Cruiser.
Right.
If you say you want it, go for it, man.
Just enjoy it.
Yeah. Just enjoy it. Own it. You know?
Totally. All right, so 80. Let's talk to me about the 80.
Okay, so the 80 is on this list with a big question mark. Now, I'm a huge 80 series guy. I have in particular an imported 80 series with the turbo diesel engine. They're great if you can find one in good condition. They're heavy. They have a lot of payload. They're a little bit underpowered. They're definitely thirsty on fuel. Just starting off with the negatives, because there are a lot of positives. They are very, very well-made vehicles. I mean, I don't know what you would think, Scott, but I would think that 80 series and the G-Wagon, they're just mechanical machines. They're really, really cool.
Very robust.
And I mean, I'm not trying to talk people out of the 80 series, but yes, can you buy an 80 series for $3,000 all day long? Is it going to be a rust bucket that was never maintained? Most likely. It's the maintenance that really makes me question the Land Cruiser. I mean, I know from personal experience, I have an emotional connection to my 80. It's not a need thing. It's a want thing. You know, I'm a Cherokee into bushings and very basic service onto my Land Cruiser using, factory parts. And I do a lot of my own work. That's something that I think, everybody says, I'm driving around the world, buy a Land Cruiser. Yeah, maybe. Like, if you're going to be
they're hard to find. It's hard to find that clean,
and they're very expensive overseas. You're going to find more affordable parts, parts for more affordable vehicles. I mean, the 80 series is a luxury vehicle. Let's be honest. Most people, you go to, I almost said Venezuela. They are literally everywhere there, but you go to some poorer countries, the Land Cruiser, Are you going to readily find parts in stock?
Most likely not. A lot of people don't realize that even Toyota dealerships, they're going to have service parts for the vehicles that everybody uses, which is going to be like a 70 series or a Hilux.
Yeah.
But finding an 80 series distributor or an 80 series coil pack, if you've got a later model, that's going to be very, very difficult to find internationally. And I think the biggest challenge with the 80 series is you can't find clean examples anymore. Mm-mm. There was a period of time where it was the vehicle of choice, and anybody who could find a clean one, they bought it, they modified it to the hilt, and now they're typically not appropriate for long distance travel. They've been too lifted, too heavy, or wheeled too hard for too long. And it's just so difficult to find a clean one. That's why that 4Runner or a Cherokee is such a great choice.
Yeah. I really think that, the 80, great vehicle, maybe not the best vehicle if you're on a budget. If you have the money, and you can put it in, they're great. I mean, we took our Land Cruiser 80 down Baja over the winter. I mean, it was great. We had our dog in the back. It was very comfortable. No dust got in, it's great, but I don't want to say how much I'm into that 80 to get it to that point.
Yeah. And we had a 96 Heritage Edition with both tanks were oversized.
Yeah.
And you needed all of that fuel capacity to get the range out of them, because 12 miles to the gallon with 35s is pretty common.
Yeah. I mean, I see 16 to 18 with my diesel. People on the internet like to tell me that, oh, you should be getting 30 in this. I'm like, no, they weren't ever really that efficient, to be honest.
Yeah, typically a diesel, you see 30 to 40% improvement over the gas car, which is exactly what your number looks like.
And in some states, that's exactly how much extra diesel costs. So Grand Vitara was one I didn't expect from you.
And I think it's because it's an international platform.
Yeah.
Sold everywhere. Any of these vehicles that were sold everywhere is something worth considering. Suzuki is still a very popular brand internationally. You'll find it in a lot of developing countries because it's affordable. They're also really small vehicles overall, but the Grand Vitara in particular is just big enough to be able to sleep inside. It's just big enough to be able to carry some additional equipment. There's heavy aftermarket support. You can get
there is
ARB
really
bumpers.
Popular in Europe.
Yeah, you can get differential locks, additional suspensions, and they do get that closer to that 20 miles to the gallon. Very reliable motors as well. I had such good success with the Jimny going across the Silk Road that I've never really forgotten the Suzuki as a consideration. And I think a Grand Vitara would be a great fit for a lot of people. Super cheap, $3,000, drive that sucker all the way down.
Yeah, I mean, if you're not into the 4-wheel drive thing at all. And you really just want to have experiences, I think, and you're on a budget, man, Grand Vitara would be,
you're totally under option. You're totally under the radar.
Yeah. I mean, nobody's going to mess with you.
No, totally under the radar.
Yeah. But yeah, so I guess this is, where we should move on. We've kind of broken this into kind of a, low, mid and a high budget tier. So let's move on to the second generation Tacoma. Those can be had, pretty easily 15 to 20
for sure.
Good examples these days. Huge amount of aftermarket. Again, you're starting to creep up in terms of price in those aftermarket accessories, but there's so many of them out there.
And it doesn't need a lot. If you buy a TRD second generation Tacoma, you've got a rear locking differential. You've got a vehicle that right out of the box doesn't require much.
No.
Just addressing some of the suspension issues. That vehicle had a very soft front spring rate and a relatively stiff rear spring rate, which made them handle, I think, pretty poorly off road.
Yeah.
So once you address that, put a little bit better shocks on it, some nice tires, you're ready to go. It doesn't really require much more than that.
Yeah. And with that second gen Taco too, you're starting to open up the ability, for a wedge camper on the back or a 4-wheel camper or something of that sort, which, they do. The 4-wheel campers in particular, I think, are a good option. They are expensive, but they maintain their value, and it's kind of an all-in-one package. I mean,
ready to go.
You could buy a bone stock second generation Tacoma, maybe do some suspension upgrades for the additional weight, throw a 4-wheel camper in the back, and you're going to be very comfortable.
Right.
You're going to have shelter, you're going to have heat, you're going to have your refrigerator, everything that you would have to buy and maybe equip separately. You can just be done and go. And you could buy a second generation Tacoma and a used 4-wheel camper, be on the road for $30,000 all day long and have everything you need to be very comfortable.
You really would. And you would just have to be careful at that point about additional accessories. You'd have to leave the ARB bumper at home and everything else, because you're 850 pounds into a camper model, even a little bit higher. The shell models can be around 500 to 550 for a second gen Tacoma, but just be mindful of that payload. Again, it just starts to creep up there.
Yeah. And you do have that first generation Tundra as well.
Another great vehicle.
Though, I mean, it's my favorite used pickup truck. They drive like a Camry, and I mean that in the highest regard.
Yeah.
They drive well. They're very reliable.
4.7 liter V8.
Essentially the same motor as the Land Cruiser. Mm-hmm. Essentially the same transmission as the Land Cruiser. Those are really bulletproof motors. I mean, the joke always is, It's what mechanics drive because they don't want to have to work on stuff after they're done. And again, one of those with a 4-wheel camper or something in the back would be a really great option.
Yeah. Some folks within Toyota years ago told me that the 4.7 liter V8 is the most reliable motor they ever brought to North America.
Yeah, I'd believe it.
And they commonly hit 500,000, 600,000.
Yeah, I think
miles.
the only known issues those things have is like a manifolds develop a little crack, but
it's pretty rare to experience an issue with those.
Yeah.
They're super, super bomber. And then of course we got 4th gen 4Runner. Another nice vehicle. They start to get a little bigger.
A little bit bigger. You're on the Prado 120 chassis,
That's
which
right.
is, again, internationally serviceable, all your bushings and bearings and that kind of stuff that seems to go wrong on the road. Very easy to do, but I don't know if I would buy a 4th generation 4Runner. Honestly, now that the GX 470, which is not only it is a Prado 120 with a few different body panels, more payload capacity. It has that V8. They're really nice places to be inside. And what are those approaching? Those are, can you get those for 10 now for a higher mileage?
Yeah.
one?
High mileage trucks, you can get 10, 12 grand. I bought one a year ago for 16. That was a really clean truck.
Yeah.
But again, you have that 4.7 liter V8, which is incredibly reliable. And in stock form, I can get 19 miles a gallon out of it.
Yeah.
5-speed automatic. The advantage also of the 470 is because it was originally designed to be a 7-passenger SUV. It has more payload than the 4Runner.
Yeah.
So once you pull those third row seats out, you gain that additional weight back on top of it. So if you're looking to add some additional weight, you want to run drawer systems, you want to run a roof tent, you want to run some heavier bumpers and winches, a GX 470 is a much better option than a 4Runner.
You're going to have some non-essential stuff that may fail on a 470, heated seats and all kinds of crazy power luxury things. But at the core of it, that has to be one of the most reliable vehicles Toyota has released here. It has that 4.7 motor. Yep. And the big thing is, I've been told by several Lexus GX 470 enthusiasts, most of them included maintenance. A lot of them were leased vehicles that were dealer serviced, dealer maintained.
Right.
Where the 4Runner, maybe not. I don't know if you have any opinions on that, but
I think you're right. I think the Toyota dealership experience is different. They're not going to get included maintenance typically. And oftentimes people buy Toyota vehicles specifically because they are reliable, which means they oftentimes forget about oil changes and stuff like that. That really happens with Toyotas relatively often, whereas Lexus owners probably a little more pedantic, a little more likely to take advantage of dealer included service contracts, things like that. But most importantly, it has that additional payload in the 4.7. You can get the 4.7 in the 4th gen 4Runner, but those are very difficult to find.
Yeah, they're pretty expensive.
And they can be more expensive than a GX. The only thing I've found on the GX is the leather is just garbage. So you tend to need to put a seat cover on it. Like an Escape Gear seat cover canvas one out of South Africa or something, but you tend to need to address the leather on the seats. But other than that, they're bomber.
Yeah. And I guess the reason I brought up that maintenance thing is for any of these vehicles that we're talking about, you have to buy the right example of it. And, more likely than not, the right example is going to be something that's well factory maintained.
Yep, absolutely.
A lot of US states don't have any kind of requirements for maintenance. Or servicing or registration inspections or that kind of thing. So, getting something with those factory service records is going to be a really good idea. But
totally, I agree.
Let's stay on that 4.7 train and talk about the 100 series Land Cruiser.
Yeah.
So probably one of the best choices.
No question.
But again, really expensive to maintain. Accessories are really expensive.
And they're difficult to find low mileage. I remember when I was looking for the GX 470, I was also looking for an LX 470 or just a Land Cruiser 470. And they were very difficult to find under 300,000 miles.
Yeah.
Very difficult.
Yeah.
And if you found a low mileage, which means hardly driven example, they could be twice the money. So they were very proud of a low mileage 100 series Land Cruiser.
And they get the money for it.
They do. And they sell because they're great vehicles. The 100 series has been our number one recommendation in the past for a used overland vehicle. If you can find a low mileage 100 series Land Cruiser, it is the right kind of vehicle to buy. 1,800 pound factory payload. You remove the third row seats and you gain some additional payload on top of that. Extremely robust drivetrain, very reliable 4.7. In most cases, they're a better choice than an 80,
100%.
Other than extreme terrain. They're going to handle better. They're going to stop better. They're going to accelerate better. They're going to be more reliable than an 80.
A little quieter. Parts are easier to find. I mean, 80 series parts are getting hard to find.
They are. And the 100 series was a global platform. So if you're down in Argentina and you go to the Toyota dealership, they're going to know what a 100 series Land Cruiser is, and they're going to be able to get parts and service it. And that's definitely one of the advantages of a Land Cruiser is you just have that global dealer infrastructure to be able to support your trip.
Yeah. But they are, again, keep dwelling on it, really expensive.
They're expensive. Yeah.
Expensive to modify. I mean, the fuel economy on them is pretty dismal. So you might want to look at for certain areas where you're traveling, you may require, a way to carry fuel, whether that's a rear bumper, which adds quite a bit of cost, or some kind of auxiliary tank.
Yeah.
But if you're thrifty, you can, there's a factory auxiliary tank that you can piece together from parts on the internet, and, you can make it work.
I think the thing to do with a 100 series, is to avoid the standard throwing the catalog at the car. I think that that's a mistake. If someone buys a 100 series Land Cruiser, they should just address suspension to gain a little bit of ground clearance. Go with a tire size that's globally available, and then just start traveling with it just as it is.
Yeah.
They're very capable vehicles. The only time I've ever seen an issue with one was with the center differential lock mechanism. Because we were doing water crossing after water crossing after water crossing in Copper Canyon in Mexico. And the vehicle that I traveled with a lot at that period of time, owned by a friend of mine, Duran, he had no issues with that car. It was extremely robust.
Yeah, they're really well made, but there's also some American options too that are really well made, really reliable. So Chris Cortez, he's the editor for Expedition Portal. He has a 7.3 Excursion that is mint.
So nice.
It's really, really nice. Now he's put some money into it, but he decided that was the vehicle that he wanted. The 7.3 diesel motor is very, very, very loud, but very, very reliable in the same regard.
If you look at Gary and Monica Westcott from the Turtle Expedition, they've driven around the world a few times in 7.3 powered diesel Fords. And they've had very, very few issues. In fact, one of their vehicles that they used to cross Siberia in the winter, they had no mechanical failures from that drivetrain. So the 7.3 is highly desirable. And because of that, they are a little more expensive. So finding a clean 7.3 Excursion is going to set you back 20 grand.
Yeah. Same with, same with the pickup version, F250, F350. They're sought after by a lot of people, not just in the Overland community, but I mean, everybody likes those things. So it is worth mentioning, you can definitely, I don't want to say skip over the 6.0. I know that there's ways to make those reliable, but I don't know if that's the best way to spend your travel money. The 6.4 gets a little bit better. The 6.7, I used to own one of those. It was a flawless motor, very quiet, decent fuel economy, but then you start to get into the diesel exhaust fluid and emissions kind of systems.
Yeah, I definitely think the 7.3 Fords, either an Excursion variant or as a pickup, starts to be a global truck. It starts to be something.
And it can handle the diesels, the different types of diesels.
For sure.
Some people may not realize the diesel that we have in the United States is ultra low sulfur diesel. And it has, they measure it in parts per million of sulfur content. It's very, very low.
50 parts per million.
50 parts per million. Yeah. You get into even Mexico, like you get
500 parts per million. 500.
And these newer engines don't necessarily like that, where the older engines thrive off of it. So, there's also the Dodge stuff, I guess I've trained myself to call them Rams now,
right?
But the Dodge Ram 2500s and 3500s, with those 12 and 24 valve Cummins motors. I mean, if there's an engine that is worshipped more than the 7.3, the only one in America would be that 12 valve Cummins. I mean, they're very reliable.
And they were available with a manual transmission, which addresses one of the main issues with both the Ford and the Dodge, which is weak transmissions behind all that torque. I would definitely look at finding a manual transmission Cummins Ram. And then from there, you can put a 4-wheel camper on the back, build out your own camper solution.
Huge payloads.
Yeah. Significant payload. You're dealing with enough payload to carry a Cherokee in the back of it, 3,000 pounds plus. So well over a metric ton of capacity in those trucks. And that starts to be really meaningful when you want to get further and further afield, where you need the durability and reliability of a diesel, but then also the fuel, cost reduction of that and the additional range. So I think a diesel, one of those North American spec diesels, is a good choice.
Yeah. I mean, we all love to, kind of romanticize the 70 series, but if you think in America, what is our 70? And it's the big American diesel trucks. They are built to work, and you can get them dolled up to massage seats, to everything, to a vinyl bench seat, depending on what you want. And they're not too expensive to fix.
They're really not. And I did a trip up to Tuktoyaktuk in the winter, on the ice roads with a bunch of the AEV Rams, and they were nice to drive. I mean, they were super safe, comfortable on the highway. You could carry as much stuff as you wanted out of them. They were really great. I think that a full size, Dodge or Ford is worth considering. Now, the downside to that is most countries do not have vehicles in that size range.
Yeah.
So they're going to be big going down the streets. You're going to have issues getting into these small colonial villages throughout the Americas.
Particularly the older you go with those American pickups, you're going to have coils or leaf springs up front on the Fords, for example, and the turning radius is like
really bad. Yeah.
Really, not ideal for some of those smaller streets and areas. But
yeah, certainly worth considering.
Yeah, certainly. If you want to go the camper route, I mean, can you do a camper in a Tacoma? 100%. People do it all the time. Do you want to do it right? Maybe consider. There's also the F-150s and the 1500s. I mean, those things are ubiquitous. Everybody knows about.
You also mentioned things. The Tundra with the 4.7.
Tundra.
That's another good choice.
But the other thing that we really, haven't spoken of is the LR4.
Right.
So there was a huge stride in reliability from the LR3 to the LR4. You moved from, I want to say, a BMW engine. It was a
BMW motor
or Jaguar motor to basically what really was a Ford motor and driveline, and that 5-liter V8. I mean, we had one for a while. It was flawless.
Literally flawless.
Very comfortable.
Not a single warranty claim on the car for years.
I remember when I drove that thing, I would turn the air conditioned seats on and the heated steering wheel on and the heat in the morning just because I could. And these are vehicles you can get for $15,000 all day long.
Yeah, they're very affordable now.
Low mileage examples for 20.
And they're a 16 to 1,800 pound payload vehicle. They have a very high roof load rating as well, 200 pounds plus from the factory. They're very comfortable to drive. The only issue that tends to be consistent with the LR4s is the airbag suspension. Yep. So you got to keep that up. You got to keep those serviced. You got to keep them in new condition. You might want to bring a spare compressor along. There's also some pretty cool little kits that allow you to have little bypasses to the airlines, so you can actually manually inflate the bags on each corner.
That's a good idea. IDT tool that we had for that, if I recall, allowed you to clear those service faults. You can put all of the overseas spec stuff on the LR4. So if you want to convert it to coil springs,
you can.
You can do all of that. The thing I do caution is, I think what makes the Land Rover so great is that air suspension. The moment you get away from the air suspension, man, I'll be honest, you're driving a Subaru with low range. I mean, they're generally, especially if they're lifted on the steel suspension, you have no down travel. You're sacrificing your up travel with spring rate. It's something to look at, definitely.
But the LR4 or the Mark III Range Rover, they're both great choices in this price range. But I think the one thing to caution people is you're still buying a Land Rover or a Range Rover, which means that maintenance and service is still going to be Land Rover, Range Rover prices.
Yes.
And a lot of people don't realize the first time you take your Mark III Range Rover in for a full factory oil change and service, you're going to spend $1,200.
Yep.
And you're going to spend $20 on a Cherokee.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. I mean, again, it's a need versus want thing. If you value comfort, and you're in the $10,000 to $20,000 price range, man, I mean, the LR4 is going to get better gas mileage than a 100 series. Yep. It's going to be quieter.
Mm-hmm. It's got a great little motor too.
Great motor. I mean, plenty of power.
Yeah, they're definitely worth considering. If Land Rover is part of your passion, the LR4 is a great choice. Personally, I would take the Mark III Range Rover over having owned both vehicles.
Yeah.
I like, most of them come with a factory rear locker. They do have more articulation, more suspension travel. It's a different chassis.
Yep.
Whereas the LR4 shares the chassis with the Range Rover Sport. So the Mark III is its own vehicle, and it does perform better off-road. It has a slightly shorter wheelbase, a better approach and departure angles overall. So I really like the Mark III Range Rover. I owned one. I had no issues with it. It was a great vehicle.
Yeah, and particularly the 2010 to 2012, the last 2 years of those have the same driveline as the LR4. But definitely be concerned, I don't think it would be unreasonable to see a Range Rover get broken into and some area that maybe isn't that safe. Keep that in mind. So I think, let's move on to what we're considering our high price range. So, these tend to be a little bit more eccentric vehicles. There's so many great options, and they're eccentric because there's so many great options in the kind of low mid, price range. I mean, obviously we're really focusing on used cars. So some of these, you could buy a new Ranger, Tacoma. I mean, the Frontiers, they're blowing those things out and they're great.
Very reasonably priced.
There are new vehicles that you can drive off the lot in this price range, but we're not focusing on new vehicles. We're focusing on things like the 200 series Land Cruiser, which is in the US, a $70,000, $80,000, $90,000 car. And they are, phenomenally reliable. I mean, I was once told that they were the strongest Land Cruiser ever made. And that might have come from you from one of your discussions with the engineer.
Yeah, we were in Nagoya, Japan, taking delivery of the 70 series for the Expedition 7 trip. And the engineer was just interested in why we chose the 70. And I said, well, it's because it's so strong and so reliable. And he's like, well, that's true. He says, but the 200 series is the most durable Land Cruiser we've ever made. And if you look underneath one, you can see it. In fact, the trucks that we drove across Antarctica, we would swap out the transfer case from a 200 and swap out the rear axle from a 200 into a Hilux, because they can handle the abuse of months in low range at minus 40 conditions. Incredibly durable vehicle. And I would absolutely recommend the 200. If someone says, price really isn't an option, I want something that's going to take me around the world with little to no trouble, I would recommend 200 series all day long. They have tons of payload, extremely robust. They have a 240 pound roof load rating. You can even convert them over to campers. That can be done in Europe. There's a couple companies that are doing that. They're also very capable, but they are big. They're a big vehicle. They're also going to be expensive to service internationally, but if you go to any country in the world, you're going to find a Toyota dealership and you're going to find local dignitaries, local politicians. They're going to drive 200 series Land Cruisers. You're going to be able to get those things serviced.
And here's the cool thing with the 200 series. I mean, again, going back to the 80 and the 100, the 80 is a classic car at this point. It's, it came out around the world in 1989. Right. Like it's older than me.
Yeah.
You're not going to walk into a dealership and find parts for an 80 or maybe a 100 series, but you're going to walk into a dealer that has mechanics that are trained on that vehicle, that they know how to work on it. I mean, the people that are working on your car right now, they're probably like me. They probably, there were kids when the 80 came out.
Right.
They don't necessarily know how to work on that stuff. It's a completely different mindset of auto repair. That is the 80, that is the 200. So that's a huge bonus for that car.
They're incredibly
safe. They have been proven in every way possible. I mean, how many miles, does Rob have on his, that's now at the Land Cruiser Museum? I mean,
hundreds of thousands of kilometers
off-road in Australia. I mean, we're talking corrugations, as I say, the size of beer cans. Like they just work.
Yeah. I remember driving that that VDJ, that twin turbo diesel 200 series across Australia in 2011. And it was one finger on the steering wheel, ultra low driver fatigue, like very comfortable. I Bluetooth to my phone. And it would go, I mean, it would easily do the Canning stock or the Cape York route, any of those technical routes you can do with a 200 series Land Cruiser, but it is extremely capable, extremely durable, extremely safe to drive. Multiple airbags, all of the safety equipment that you get with a modern vehicle, but it still retains that Toyota Land Cruiser durability and reliability. And that's what makes it, I think, the number one choice in that price range. But there are some other cool cars.
I mean, it's probably the number one choice as far as used overland vehicles go. Sure. I mean, you're going to end up spending the same amount of money realistically on a 100 series right now as you are on a 200
in many cases. Yeah. So what would you buy in this price range, Matt?
G-Wagon. No. GX 460 would be really high on my list. A good buddy of mine, Brian Dorr from Exploring Elements, just started building one that he's debuting at SEMA. And, it's the first really clean one that I've seen. He had a custom bumper made for it, a custom roof rack made specifically for his needs. They're really comfortable. They're really reliable. They're a Prado 150. You can service them everywhere. Again, mechanics know what they're working on with this vehicle. It's still currently sold. It's sold. I mean, a Prado would have to be more common than a 200 series Land Cruiser around the world. They would have to sell more of them.
They do for sure.
You have that nice V8. It's really quiet. Most of them have air conditioned seats and heated seats and decent payload. I think almost all of them were 7 seats.
They were 7-seat vehicles, which
I know there were 5-seat, but most of them were 7s.
Yeah. So that's going to get you that 1,700 pound payload capacity, which is going to allow you to put bumpers on it.
And if you want to do the crazy suspension kind of thing, because you want it, maybe you don't necessarily need it. A lot of the Forerunner stuff that people are developing these days, the long travel, whatever you want to do,
it crosses
GX, over. I mean, why the GX 460? I mean, I think it is becoming a lot more popular than it ever has been.
People are recognizing.
Lexus did a GX off-road concept, which was really
just a couple months ago. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, so they recognize they have something there. The G500 Mercedes, they're interesting vehicles.
Right.
I'll just say that. I mean, they are, I like to refer to them as like the Leica camera of overland vehicles. They're very durable. They look bulletproof. I mean, Scott, you know more about the G's than I do.
Well, it's the vehicle I've owned the longest of any vehicle. I've had my G-Wagon since 2009.
Yeah.
And it isn't as reliable as a Toyota, but it's a lot more reliable than a Land Rover. So it kind of gives you that eclectic feel of a Defender, but more of the reliability of a Toyota.
Yeah.
Which I think is unique. So if you're looking for a unique vehicle that has factory triple diff locks, factory solid axles, factory coil sprung suspension, mine has an 1,800 pound payload capacity.
Yeah. Huge.
So right out of the box, they were designed to be a military vehicle. They were commissioned by the Shah of Iran in the 1970s to be a military vehicle and an asset protection vehicle. So but they are very unique. They're different. It's hard to find mechanics that know how to work on them. But Mercedes has a massive dealer network around the world
and they haven't changed much. You could have a brand new G-Wagon and they're going to be, nearly identical to when they came out with the Shah of Iran. I mean, you're still going to find dealer mechanics that know how to work on them, that are trained on them. The Mercedes parts network it's impressive, is phenomenal. I mean, they can have parts anywhere in the world in, days.
And one thing that's actually very cool about Mercedes that not many people know, if you were to go buy a new Mercedes G-Wagon today, it comes with a 12-month unlimited mile international warranty.
I did not know that.
People do not know that. You can go, if you buy a brand new Mercedes, you can drive it to Europe. You can drive it down Africa. If you have any issues with any Mercedes purchased anywhere in the world, it comes with a factory 12-month unlimited mile warranty.
That's pretty cool.
It's very cool. So if you wanted to buy a new G-Wagon, you just rock up to the dealership and say, hey, I need a new whatever.
Yeah. I mean, if you have 130 or 140 grand in your pocket, but the cool thing with the G-Wagon is, good examples of G500s, which have that 5-liter V8 that's bulletproof. They're US spec vehicles. You can get those for $20,000. Now, some of them are going to have high miles.
Yep.
It's pretty common for people to swap, newer stuff on them so they look a little bit better. The sky's the limit with what you want to spend on them. They generally are not as modified as some other vehicles can be, but still, a great choice. I always say, like, the G-Wagon is what you thought the Defender actually was.
Right.
And there's imported G-Wagons too. I mean, if you want to go ex-military G-Wagon with,
diesel, whatever,
you can have them. And it was the vehicle of Tom Shepard for like some time.
I think if you can own one car and you want something that's unique and different, the G-Wagon's a great vehicle.
Yeah.
It does everything relatively well, all the way up to crossing the Rubicon. People have driven them across the Rubicon pretty regularly. So they're great choices to consider. But there's not much. This is rarefied air once you get into that $30,000 range. I mean, you can certainly buy a Trail Edition 4Runner. That's worth considering, I would say, as well. You start looking at like a 2018 Dodge Ram, you can still get with a manual transmission. There are some vehicles in that range that are definitely worth considering.
Yeah.
I don't know that the newer Tacoma would be high on my list of recommendations. It's just doesn't.
Certainly very popular.
It's extremely
for good reasons.
It's extremely popular. I just think that there might be better options now.
Yeah, I mean it's a wonderful truck. It's made very well. It's very reliable. You can't fault Toyota for saying that they provided the consumer with a bad truck. I just don't think that 3.5 Atkinson cycle motor is my favorite.
Particularly when you pair it with that 6-speed automatic with a very high first and second gear.
Yeah.
If they had geared that transmission properly, I think it would have been a completely different story. But if you look at a JL Wrangler or a Gladiator, it's nearly 5-to-1 first gear in the transmission, automatic. And that makes a huge difference. Whereas the Tacoma, I think, is in the high 3s-to-1 first gear. And when you deal with a lower torque off idle engine, a lower displacement engine, it does not keep up with the competition in that regard.
Yeah. I remember there's the ARB Tacoma,
right?
What were you seeing? Horrible gas mileage and everything. And that was very modestly modified. I mean, it was a very tasteful vehicle in the way it was done, but I mean, I remember Bruce and I took that thing out and it was
they struggle.
10 miles to the gallon.
Yeah. They really struggle.
But if you re-gear them,
that helps.
They're pretty good.
That helps. And it's definitely, we're not recommending against a Tacoma. It's just that with the second gen, they were so compelling. First gen, they were so compelling. Right now you can look at, like, you can buy a ZR2 with a diesel, front and rear differential locks, Multimatic suspension. You can actually get the vehicle we've always wanted, but it has a different,
even with a diesel brand. If you want it.
Yeah, exactly.
And that is a rest of the world spec vehicle again.
It is.
Very durable. You have the Ranger that has come out. Hasn't been as popular as I thought it was going to be, but all of those things land in the 30 to 40.
They do
price range. So
buy the 200, be done.
Just buy a 200 and be done. But if you want a new vehicle, frankly, a new vehicle is probably a better choice than most of these. I do think there's one last thing before we wrap up that's worth talking about. And it is the imported trucks.
For sure.
Now we're putting these in the high end category, even though some of them you might be able to get for $5,000 to $10,000, but know that these are old vehicles that require a lot of maintenance and refurbishment. I mean, you're
25-year-old vehicles.
You're not only buying something sight unseen, you're, in the case of Japanese vehicles, you're buying something sight unseen from an auction in Japan in a language you have no hope of deciphering.
Right.
So, I both of the Land Cruisers that we've had that are imported, we got through Steve Jackson at Land Cruisers Direct. Now that guy has great relationships.
He's the one to work with.
Yeah, he's the guy to go with. I don't necessarily know if you want to import a Defender 110. I don't know if there's a standout person that I'm sure. Do you
Nobody
research?
that I can think of.
Yeah.
There's people that are bringing them in and then refurbishing them fully. So like Heritage and those other brands, those are doing a nice job.
Arconic, I want to say, is one that does some high end stuff.
But certainly on the Land Cruiser side, which is probably the vehicle to consider, or a Nissan Patrol would be another good example. You can bring in those trucks, or you can go over to Europe and buy that 300 TDI manual transmission D1 you've always wanted, or a G-Wagon. Those are all possible.
Yeah.
And we actually talked about this when we were preparing for this podcast, was go to Europe, buy a vehicle over there, actually go see it, and make a vacation out of it, drive it around Europe, and then stick it in a container. You're going to save a lot of money if you do it that way. I've seen Series 1 Discoveries with diesels, low mileage for 7,000 or 8,000 euros.
Yeah.
How fun would that be? Go over there, do a proper vacation, take it to Morocco, and then ship it home.
Yeah, there. I mean, and there's other places you can do that in New Zealand. You can do that in Australia. I mean, if you don't forget the fact that you can, if you're going to be overseas, buy the vehicle overseas.
Yeah.
You know, as long as it's 25 years or older, you can bring it back. And honestly, you'll probably save money. Well, you will save money at least one way on shipping. And you'll also be able to bring back a really cool souvenir that, depending on how attached you get to it, you know, you could sell it. I mean, you could go to Australia right now and buy a Land Cruiser Troop Carrier for 10 grand. And bring it back over here and sell it for 25.
This really is the high watermark of overlanding of any time that I can think of as an overland.
So many options.
There are so many options. You can bring in that Defender 110 you've always wanted. You can bring in the 70 series you've always wanted. You can buy a used 200 series now. You can find a diesel powered front and rear diff lock domestic mid-sized trucks.
We are in the golden age of four-wheel drives.
It certainly is the golden age.
I hope people are realizing that. I mean, I remember when people thought independent suspension, even in the front, was the death of four-wheel drives. Well, then we invented the Raptor,
right? And
everybody just forgot about that. They're like, "Oh, you mean I can go 100 mile an hour off road on a factory truck?" Okay, you know, totally. I mean, everything has its advantages. There's so many options these days.
There really is. Yeah, and it's been fun to talk about it. Thank you all for listening. Remember, the most important thing is when you set your budget, emphasize the travel first and the vehicle and the accessories second. And we will talk to you next time.